Hello, this is Rocky Marciano. When I was heavyweight champion of the world, they called me the Brockton Blockbuster. You find out why.
Welcome to the Rocky Marciano Archives. Today's upload is the first of two parts. This features an article from the Saturday Evening Post published in the January 12th, 1952 edition and is narrated by myself. The following is the remarkable account by Carmine Vingo, as told to Seymour Shubin, of his career, his meeting with Marciano, and his battle to live a meaningful life after his career was dramatically ended, a battle he would eventually win. Carmine's words are important. Not only are they telling his story, but the story of all who climb between the ropes dreaming of a better life. We know you'll get a lot out of this. 2 years ago, Bingo Vingo was a hot prospect for glory as heavyweight champ. Today he's through, partly blind, partly paralyzed, dependent on his wife for a living he can't earn. This is his own story. I was slaughtered to please a crowd, by Carmine Vingo, as told to Seymour Shubin. It was a big night for me, my first 10-rounder in the Garden. I was Bingo Vingo, and nothing was going to stop me from winning the heavyweight crown someday. This fight, it was with Rocky Marciano in December of 1949 when I was 20, was just going to be a stepping stone, but it turned out to be a stepping stone down instead of up. Today, the kid who thought he could punch his way to glory is lucky he can walk, and he can just about close his left hand. The night before the big fight, I did a lot of dreaming. I dreamed about getting married, buying a house somewhere in the country, and owning a fancy car. I'm married now, but if it wasn't for my wife and in-laws, I don't know what I'd have done for bread these past couple of years. And as for the car, they don't like you to drive one when you're partly blind. It was a good dream and a hard fall. One day it's your name and picture in the papers, and then it's sitting by a window, ashamed to go outside because you're a husky guy and your wife's got to support you. This past September, I went to Georgie Flores's funeral, a kid who died from injuries in the ring. A lot of people were there I hadn't seen in a long time. Some of them were the ones who'd promised me so much when I was in the hospital, who'd told me not to worry, that they'd set me up in business or get me a job. Some of these fellows looked at me now like they'd forgotten I was alive. After the funeral, one of them came over. "How you doing, Carmine?" I nodded. "I'm doing." He turned to a friend. "Here's a kid what really had it." He made a fist and jabbed the air. "He really had it. Could have been champ, this boy." Walking away later, I couldn't get his words out of my head. I'd had it once, all right. 16 straight KOs once. Hit 'em and down they went. I remembered one fellow I fought back in the amateurs. His name was Lou Castle, and he was my buddy. I didn't like the idea of fighting Lou, but my manager said if you weren't willing to fight anyone, anywhere, you might as well give up. During the fight, although I still felt strange about it, I clipped Lou, and he went against the ropes. That was in the first round. He was helpless, and the crowd knew it, and I knew it too. I could hear, "Kill him, Bingo! Kill him!" And suddenly I went crazy. The guy in front of me wasn't my buddy anymore. He was just something I wanted to bring down. I think I must have hit him 25 times. He sagged, but the ropes wouldn't let him fall, and then he slid sideways to the canvas. He pulled himself up by the ropes, and I went after him again. This time he fell hard, like a board falls. Straight back, legs stiff, arms by his sides. He was on the canvas 5 minutes before he came out of it, and all that time I was thinking, I killed him. I killed my buddy. He was my buddy again, see? And I was a human being once more. A few minutes before, I'd wanted to knock his brains out. Remembering all this now didn't give me any pleasure. It made me a little sick, in fact. I was glad I wasn't in a business anymore where you were a person 1 minute and a killer the next. The killer was out of me. I wondered how I'd ever had it. But to be a good fighter, you've got to have a little of the killer in you. You can't be afraid of what's going to happen to you or the other guy. I broke a couple knuckles on a guy's head once, and once I got butted and had to have 3 stitches over my eye. Almost every day when I looked in the mirror, I saw a different face than I'd seen the day before, yet I still never thought I'd get hurt bad. Queer Street or blindness or death happened only to guys you didn't know. The story I'm telling here is mine, but it could be the story of almost any kid you've seen in an arena or on your television set. He's not a champ, and never will be. And probably you've never heard his name before. He climbs through the ropes, jiggles around, and waves at the crowd. He wears a robe with his name on it. Maybe he's only making $50 or $100 out of the match, but in his own eyes, he's a big man, another Dempsey or Sugar Ray. Later, he might win and dance out or get hurt and be carried out, but soon you've forgotten him. Most fellows I know became boxers because they had nowhere else to go. Life usually was rough for them. They had the physical makeup, they'd heard the stories of fancy purses, of fighters mingling in high society, and so they took the only road to glory that was open to them. My dream began when I was 16 and behind bars, awaiting trial for stealing an automobile. It was the first time I'd ever got in trouble, and it scared me. The second day there, I saw, in a newspaper, a picture of my older brother, Jimmy, and it showed him as an amateur boxer. I hadn't even known he was fighting. My father had been an old-time boxer, but I'd never given any thought to fighting. But now, alone in jail and scared, I could see where I was heading, and it wasn't good. Becoming a fighter suddenly became my only hope. The neighborhood where I was born was a poor section of the Bronx, around 152nd and Morris. When I was 3, I got my first bad break, a punctured right eardrum which left me deaf in that ear. As soon as I was old enough, I quit school and worked at odd jobs. When I was 16, I left home. For weeks, I slept in parked cars. Then I started borrowing cars, taking rides in them, and parking them. Somehow, I never considered it really stealing. I was just a car-crazy kid who only wanted to be behind a wheel. But making a U-turn on a one-way street put me behind bars, for that's how a cop happened to catch me. My brother visited me in jail the day after I saw his picture. When he heard I wanted to be a fighter, he said he'd send his manager Billy Maselli to see me. Before leaving, he said, "Look, you got lots of free time here. Why don't you exercise?" It sounds funny now, but it didn't then. I started doing knee bends and push-ups, and I'd shadow box around my cell. One guard thought I'd gone crazy. I was in jail 12 days, and then put on a year's probation. I swore I'd never see the inside of a cell again. Billy Maselli, who'd agreed to take me on, bought me the equipment I needed and got me a locker in Bobby Gleason's gym in the Bronx. A lot of good boys were working out there then, fellows like Jake LaMotta, Walter Cartier, Steve Belloise. I felt good every time they'd as much as nod at me. One of them used to wear hand-painted ties, and hand paints were the first things I was going to buy when I got into the money. Nat Perrigine was my trainer. In Gleason's, there's a bell that rings every 3 minutes, which is a round. You do everything by rounds. Loosen up, shadow box, skip rope, work the heavy and light bags. The sandbag is mostly for power, the speed bag for your reflexes. Nat stayed close to me. The speed bag used to give me trouble, and he'd say patiently, left it, right it, hook it." I was never a gym beater, a fancy boy in training, but soon I had that speed bag going easily, and I was able to work some pretty good steps while rope skipping. Sometimes I'd do road work, early in the morning in a nearby park. Even though I was only training as an amateur, I worked out with the pros. Once I got smart with Steve Belloise and tried to KO him. After that, the ring got too small for me. He almost chased me out to the street. But they all told me I had the stuff. My first amateur fight was in March of 1947. 8 of us shared one dressing room. Our opponents were in a room down the hall. Wood benches and hooks on the walls and gear lying all around, and the mixed smell of sweat and liniment. My fight was the 4th, and Billy Maselli had me shadow box in a corner. One kid had his fight stopped because of a cut. I watched his trainer squeeze it together and put strips of adhesive tape over it like stitches. I was nervous to begin with, and this didn't do me any good. Someone called, "Fourth bout," and Billy nodded for me to walk out. At the door, I made the sign of the cross. A lot of my friends were there, and they started cheering when they saw me. My vision was blurred. I don't even remember climbing in the ring. In our corners, the other boy blessed himself, and I did it again, too. Whatever I'd been taught about tactics, I forgot that first round. I just started throwing punches. The other boy hadn't had any fights before either, and he was swinging just as wildly. We weren't getting paid, but we had to be pulled apart at the bell. Back in corner, Billy and Nat calmed me down. In the second round, I was more deliberate. Toward the middle, I saw an opening and shot in a right. I could feel it through my wrist. His jaw seemed to give. He fell back and then down, and on the canvas he turned over and lay on his belly. It was the first time I'd ever made the ship sail, and it was a strange feeling. I hadn't been sure I could knock out a guy. This kid on the floor, he did something to me, gave me a feeling of power. Now I could lick anyone in the world. When I walked down the aisle after the count, guys were cheering me and hitting me on the back. Afterward, about 20 of us went out to celebrate. I was the king. It was like I'd won the championship. We went to a small Italian restaurant and took it over. We marched among the tables, singing. I had to make a speech. While we were carrying on, one fellow jumps up and yells, "Here's Carmine! Here's the other Uy! Bingo!" And he smacked a fist into his palm and dropped to the floor. Everyone roared. Someone cried, "Hey, Bingo!" And from then on, that was my name. Bingo Vingo, the kid who couldn't miss. I had 15 amateur fights after that. Each ended in a KO, and after each one, a mob went out to celebrate. Always to the same restaurant, our lucky restaurant. Those fights began to pay pretty good, considering that I was an amateur. I'd get a percentage of each ticket I sold, and sometimes I'd get rid of a couple hundred. Also, I used to win prizes, and I'd sell these. You could get $15 for a watch, for a pen and pencil set a little less. When I turned pro that same year, the contract I signed with Billy Maselli was the standard one okayed by the New York Boxing Commission. Off the top would come all expenses, such as for training camp, bandages, hotel bills. Then the manager would get 33% of the rest, and the handler 10%. The fighter gets what's left, and out of that come taxes. It doesn't leave too much, especially since 4-rounders usually pay about $50, 6-rounders from $125 to about $300, depending where the fight's held. I was lucky with the 2 managers I had in my time. They never took their cuts, although later on I had to pay training expenses. They were willing to wait until I got a good purse. But I'd say a lot of the boys aren't that lucky. They make $50 and all the percentages and expenses come off. Kids don't realize it's almost impossible to become rich in the few good years a fighter's got. I had about 20 fights under Billy, dropping 2 of the early ones. After those lickings, I won 12 straight, including 2 quick KOs as a preliminary boy in the garden. By then, I was a neighborhood big shot. Write-ups and pictures were appearing in the papers. People said hello to me I'd never seen before. Kids stopped me to ask for autographs. And although I wasn't making any big purses yet, I was living good for a boy who'd slept in cars not too long ago. I bought sport jackets and fancy slacks. I'd never had more than 1 pair of shoes at a time in my life. Now I had 3. I copied the clothes of the big-name boys, even the way they walked. One thing I wasn't worried about was the future. As far as I was concerned, I was set. Why bother to learn a trade when I wouldn't need one? My one big dream was someday buying a long convertible and pulling up to the corner of 152nd and Marift, casual-like I'd been used to this sort of thing all my life. I could picture the fellows and girls swarming around it, touching it, asking how much it cost, and me shrugging and saying 3 or 4 grand, like I wasn't quite sure. When my contract with Billy ended around April 1948, Billy told me he was going to devote full time to the butcher store he owned. It was just about then that I got a call from Jackie Levine. a manager with a growing stable of big-name fighters. He said he'd heard about me, and he'd like me to come to Stillman's gym so he could look me over. Stillman's isn't much as far as appearances go, but to me it was like heaven. Almost every fighter in New York who was anything trained there. While Jackie and Whitey Bimstein, the famous trainer, watched, I worked out on the bags. I was a little worried that they wouldn't think I was fancy enough, but I couldn't do anything wrong that day. When I looked up, Jackie was nodding at Whitey. I was definitely on my way. Rubbing shoulders with the big boys. From then on, I did most of my training at Stillman's and my road work around the reservoir in Central Park. Jackie sent me to my first training camp, and it was a thrill rubbing shoulders with fellows like Rocky Graziano and Gus Lesnevich. At most camps, the big-name boys ate at separate tables from the small fry like me. I told myself that I'd be at one of those separate tables someday. But all the fighters, small fry included, were treated like incubator babies. I remember going to a movie in town one night, walking the 5 miles there and back. It was dark by the time I came home. I never knew the world got so black. But walking up the road, I saw a light ahead. It was Whitey Bimstein with a lantern, guiding me in like an airplane. He'd been searching for me everywhere, even in the well. He didn't leave me until I was in bed. Meanwhile, I'd fallen in love. I'd met Kitty Rhea about the time I signed with Jackie. She was something different for me. Unlike most girls I'd met, she wasn't impressed by my clippings. She told me she didn't like fighters. After we went together a while, it turned out that it wasn't so much fighters she didn't like as fighting. By the time we were going steady, she was begging me to give it up. She was afraid I'd get hurt. I told her I'd quit as soon as I saved enough money to start a business. I don't know if I meant that. I had my eyes on the heavyweight crown. I'd won all the 11 fights I'd had under Jackie so far. How could I give it up now? In November 1949, Kitty and I made plans to get married. I would be 20 on December 29th, old enough to fight 10-rounders. We didn't set the date, though, because I didn't have enough money. I spoke to Jackie about getting me a big purse fight, and he said he'd be able to get me a 10-rounder at the Madison Square Garden with Rocky Marciano, an undefeated boy who'd won 23 out of 25 by KOS. Within a few days, the papers were signed. The bout was to be on Friday, December 30th, the day after my birthday. The purse would be $1,500, although $400 probably would have to come out for training expenses. Kitty and I happily set our wedding date for February 19th. A lot of people have said since that I should never have met Marciano then, that I was pushed up too fast. After all, it was only my first 10-rounder and I'd never gone more than 6 before. But I'll never blame anyone for that fight. I wanted it because I needed the money. Marciano was to knock out Joe Louis a couple years later, but he meant nothing to me then. In fact, in some of my fights, I never knew my opponent until I was in the ring. And Marciano being a 3-to-1 favorite didn't mean anything to me either. I never trained harder for any fight. This was my first style fight, and if I got by this one, there would be more. On the day of the bout, I weighed in at 189, my sharpest. The Thursday afternoon before the fight, I saw Kitty. This was my birthday, but we weren't going to celebrate it until the following night. We'd celebrate my victory then as well as my birthday. The guests had been invited. Kitty said she wanted to go to the fight for luck, but I didn't want her there. I'd never let her see any of my bouts. I'd always been afraid she might see me lose or get cut. I think I was awake most of that night. I knew I had to sleep, and yet I couldn't for a long time. Not that I was fighting the actual bout beforehand. In my mind, I was past the fight. I was spending the money already from that purse and the purses to follow. At 8 o'clock the next night, I was in my dressing room. I was excited but not nervous. You could hear the noise of the crowd echoing through the corridor. Whitey taped my hands and I shot a few punches, and then he put on the gloves. I danced up and down a little. "Show him who's boss right away," Jackie was saying. Then there was a loud roar, and I knew the fight going on was over. Whitey tied the cord to my robe. I blessed myself twice before the call came. I walked out, Jackie and Whitey and Freddie Brown, my other handler, in back. The corridor, and then 6 big steps up, the blur of faces all around. And that is all I remember. Thank you for listening to this first part of Carmine's story. Part 2 will follow soon, so hit that subscribe button and notification bell to ensure you don't miss Carmine's recollection of his biggest battle of all. We will see you down the road.
If you like this content, then hit the subscribe button. To really support this channel, consider joining for just over $1 a month and unlock ad-free members-only content. Every member will play a key part in revealing the real Rocky.
I just enjoyed combat. I just enjoyed the sport that I had learned so well, and I had practiced so much that when the bell rang, I did a job. I could concentrate on the opponent.
It was a great, great career for me. I'm proud and very happy to talk about it. Sometimes I wonder why I was such an aggressive man in the ring.